Hello, and thank you for joining us in Mapping the Zone, the newest podcast dedicated to informal discussion of the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. My name is Cody. I'm one of the co-hosts here.
I'm Will.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Kate.
And we are wrapping up The Crying of Lot 49. Today we're on Chapter 6. Another big one. Chapter 5 was pretty lengthy as far as this book is concerned. Chapter 6 is pretty much the same length, so quite a bit, I think, to go over. So, Will, I'll pass it over to you for a summary of the chapter.
Thanks. Oedipa returns to Echo Courts. The paranoid seem even more out of sorts than usual. It turns out Metzger's absconded with Serge's sweetheart, and this news is broken to Oedipa via song. Serge has decided to do as his elders instruct and move on to girls far younger than he. Oedipa finds a note from the evacuate attorney assuring her that, legally, all was clear. He's passed his duties on to another. The sterility stung. She finally calls Randolph Driblet, but his mother picks up and vaguely states that their lawyer would make a statement later that day. Moving on to other loose threads, Oedipa now rings Emery Bortz and is invited into his home by Grace, his wife. En route, she sees that Zaff's used books has burnt down, and when she stops to inquire, the owner of the next-door surplus store alleges arsonic fraud. He brags on his business acumen, having cleverly invested in the production of fraudulent swastika armbands and various SS-themed sundries. Oedipa is disgusted, and it takes her the rest of the drive to the Bortzes to cool down. She meets a few of the Bortz kids and makes acquaintance with Grace, who points her to the backyard, what turns out to be a small wake for Driblet attended to by a few grad students. He had, without explanation, walked himself into the sea to drown, the rap night of the courier's tragedy. Professor Bortz and the crowd bemoan his loss, as the man had been, in their esteem, the most able to connect with the historical Wharfinger. Oedipa asks about the Tristero line of the play, and Bortz is shocked. That variation only existed, to his knowledge, in a pornographic reworking of the play held in secret under lock and key of the Vatican archives. That is, until Oedipa presents her paperback edition of Jacobean revenge plays. They all pontificate on the possible causes for Driblet's line substitution, but have no real ideas. Bortz invites her to look at some of his Wharfingeriana, and shares that a colleague theorized the pornographic parody had been written for the purpose of demonstrating the immorality of theater by an extreme Puritan sect. Said sect may have chosen to epitomize the evils of worldliness as Tristero. Leaving momentarily to formally invite the ending of the wake, Bortz first directs Oedipa to a medieval travelogue by a strange blowhard named Diocletian Blob. Once she acclimates to the early modern English idiom, she reads a story remarkably similar to the scene of assassination of Niccolo from the courier's tragedy. Bortz assumes he'd been spared so to spread the word of the shadowy org to their next target, revolutionary England. Over the next few weeks, Bortz and Genghis Cohen collect shards of information in their respective fields, literary history and philately, and pass them along to our heroine. It seems that in the late 16th century, in a dispute over heredity for executorship of the postal monopoly in modern Belgium, may have inspired one Hernando Joaquin de Tristero y Calavera to start an illicit courier service whose purpose over the years evolved from undermining Tristero's supposed usurper's power to simply wreaking havoc among Thurn and Taxis routes. Oedipa and all those she'd met at the Bortzes attend Driblet's funeral, and return to his grave to toast the man with his own preferred varietal of wine in the night. Oedipa can't help but feel she's lost someone important to her, wonders if he was just another silenced by those conspiring to sever her connections, like her husband, therapist, and co-executor. She cries out to his spirit, but receives no reply. As they continue digging through text for hints, Bortz, him always the dramaturge, elaborates a scene during the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire, where the Tristero conspiracy proposes a merger to their sworn foes. Perhaps that way they would have turned the initial snubbing of their founder's inheritance into control of the whole network of couriers across the continent. However, no such deal was made, and Thurn and Taxis dissolve, and so follow any hints to the next happenings in the history of their adversary. Emery Bortz may have waded too deeply into the mire alongside Oedipa, as he's even theorizing, without cause, that others may suspect the entire French Revolution to have been a plot to eliminate the last reaches of the previous monopoly, Her doubts brewing, Oedipa has started to question the sincerity of his paranoia and is reluctant to expand the circle investigation. At some point, she returns to the scope and finds Mike Fallopian, now seeming to be off-grid. He asks, and she updates him about the quest for the post horn. At this point, even the Penguin follower expresses concerns about the verifiability of this information. It hits a little too close to the chest, and Oedipa leaves, surprised by his sudden hatred. Cohen continues unearthing rare fraudulent stamps, including one that reveals the meaning of waste. We await silent Tristero's empire. But now Oedipa's trust is waning. Pierce had owned the Tank Theater, the strip mall holding Zaff's and the surplus store, had endowed Bortz's current employer. Cohen had been hired by Metzger. Yet she couldn't square this with what she'd seen in the streets of San Francisco, the hordes who had all seemed to in touch with the underground network. She settles on 4 choices. She'd stumbled onto a huge conspiracy that took only subtle hinting to plainly see. Inverarity had tricked her into believing so. She was imagining the plot, or she was imagining Inverarity tricking her. All that gave her worse the hope for insanity, that being the easiest to accept. She goes to a clinic under Grace Bortz's name, requests a pregnancy test, but does not return for the results. Cohen finds some esoteric article in a 40-year-old stamp collector's magazine, which theorizes that the remaining Tristero had collapsed in the French Revolution, and those independent couriers operated at the behest of even more independent early anarchists, while the majority left for the USA in the mid-1850s. It seems they'd discarded ambitions of continental monopoly and settled for masquerading as raiding parties of Plains tribes to remain a hidden opposition. Later, he shares some stamp auction gossip. Some stranger has entered the bidding for the lot of mistaken stamps, revealed as the eponymous Lot 49. He believes the stranger could be a fixer from the conspiracy, looking to keep the evidence concealed. At this point, Oedipa has no faith in the veracity of anything which made it to her attention via Cohen or Bortz. She can't bring herself to investigate their claims herself, either. In such a state of pure doubt, she calls the Greek Way and asks for the Enamorado Anonymous. When he picks up, she explains her predicament and demands total honesty, threatening suicide. All he says is, "It's too late," expounding with "for me" before hanging up. Disoriented, wandering on foot, Oedipa realizes the true domain that Pierce's legacy had encompassed, the nation around her. Mourning, recalling bits of business he'd shared with her, she wonders whether, if it was his plot to introduce her to the Tristero, it had been a cruel act of grace to share this mystery, or a bitter reaching for immortality by corrupting her very mind with the same stamps she'd resented for his attention. She mulls further the simultaneous banality and inferred meaning of all the verifiables, accepting the paradoxical synthesis of America and the post-horn. Finally, exhausted of excuses, she calls the auction agent, who one believed represented the Tristero's interests. He says the client had decided to attend the auction, and so Oedipa decides to do the same. She arrives, cloaked in glares from either those conspiring against her or simply see how far out of place she is. There she meets Genghis Cohen, who'd come for his own purposes, and shares the auctionary definition of crying. Oedipa settled back to await the crying of Lot 49. Finn.
All right. So, first things first, how does everyone feel about this chapter?
I think it's an interesting chapter for a couple of reasons, obviously, but I think it represents sort of a shifting of the narrative, less so from Oedipa's perspective of trying to hunt down the meaning behind these symbols, behind this alternate post service, behind Tristero, and instead shifts more to the implications of what that organization is. There are certainly clues filled in as far as its past, its history, how it came to be in the 100 years or 200 years prior to the sort of portion of the narrative we're getting into, and then eventually when it eventually made its way to America. So we get some fill in there, but it sort of morphs towards the end of the book away from the protagonist and to a series of comments on America and also to like industrialism and capitalism through the lens of Pierce and this sort of community of San Narciso that he's made, and how those two things enmesh together. And I think what's most interesting about the decision to do that narratively is it sort of is signaling the idea that Oedipa has accepted that there are no answers, that she's reached a point where she understands that she's never going to get the answer she's looking for. She's never going to hunt down, the postmaster general for W.A.S.T.E or whoever that person might be. She's never going to realize why it is that these things came to her, whether or not Pierce was involved in it. And so instead, choosing to put it here at the end of the book, it seems like she is mentally moving to a position where she instead is considering what this all means in the lens of America as a whole, and where America is at in the years that the book is taking place in. And it's a very Pynchon sort of decision to make, where he moves from these very personal elements that the book operates in for most of its length to the greater implications of what these things may mean, which is something he does across his entire canon.
Yeah, that I can't put it any better than that.
Yeah, I can't disagree at all. Although I find it, I guess, interesting that you view it as more of a zooming out, whereas when I read this chapter, I almost feel like it's zooming closer and closer into Oedipa herself, rather than her conscious state of trying to collect the clues together. It seems to me like this chapter is, while it's also doing that heavy, deep work of synthesizing the real, whatever reality of the facts, the real history of the Tristero, it is also really focusing on just how broken up it has made Oedipa's psyche, just how much she truly feels isolated, and not in the dramatic sense, but just in this sad, cold, empty sense of, I have all of this, but nobody here cares or believes me, and if they do believe me, then they're as good as dead.
It does seem like this is probably the loneliest chapter of the book. I mean, there is that passage about how Oedipa is losing all her men, with Metzger running off with someone else, Mucho and her growing apart, Driblet dying, even her seeing Mike Fallopian. Mike Fallopian is seemingly more interested in the attention of other people, and Mike Fallopian also kind of is pretty negative in his interaction with her. And even the passages leading up to the very end, the passages leading up to the auction, where Oedipa goes driving on the freeway and then wanders around a railroad station. Those are pretty kind of haunting, sad passages.
Yeah, it's definitely a bleak chapter and a somewhat bleak ending, which is not out of character for Pynchon, especially with his earlier work. It seemed to me, everything that all of you said, I totally agree with. And it kind of, I kind of had this image of Oedipa coming out of the fog of everything that had happened up to this point, and realizing that she was, I don't want to say it had kind of hit a rock bottom, but had realized, that she didn't really have anything left after all of this. That, like you all said, the men in her life were gone. The information that she had, whatever it's even worth, doesn't really mean anything to anybody else other than her. And that's pretty much all she has now. And it's just sad to have gone on that journey with her and just seen the kind of step by step going down. That's a terrible way to phrase it, but she, just repeatedly has things taken away from her, her agency, the people in her life, the meaning in her life is all just kind of stripped away from her bit by bit. And then this is, the ultimate, realization of all of that for her.
Yeah, very true. I think the two halves of how the chapter is constructed are very much related to one another, because as she is pushed further into isolation, she has no option but to look to the things external to her and continue to wonder what they all say about the environment that she spent 252 pages existing in up until now.
I guess a footnote to my reaction to the chapter this time through is that Luke, I kind of owe you an apology. Back in chapter 2's discussion, you brought up the theory about whether Oedipa had been somehow spiritually or literally impregnated by Metzger. And reading this chapter through, I guess I just completely forgot just how much that was here in this final chapter.
Yeah, it doesn't seem 100% clear, in my opinion. But I get what you're saying. She does schedule the visit with the gynecologist, and it does seem to kind of imply that there's something going on there. Yeah, that guy that I keep on referencing, Robert Kahn, interpreted that passage as being about a miscarriage, a possible miscarriage, which would just kind of add to the general sadness of the chapter. One thing that I like to think about with this chapter is, again, I talked about this last week, but it did remind me of On the Road. The ending of On the Road, how sad the ending of On the Road is, and the Beat Generation in general. The ending of the chapter leading up to the auction does, like, she's wandering around the railroad station and kind of contemplating people that have dropped out of society and are squatting in old trains and stuff, and seems to kind of be contemplating the dark side of the American dream, which I do think the Beat Generation addresses a lot. And there's something that I've been thinking about for a few weeks now, but there's something that Kerouac called end of land sadness. I think in relation to San Francisco and California, but even end of land sadness that could apply to Droblet killing himself by walking into the ocean. And there is that passage of near the end where she can't see the mountains and she also can't see the ocean, and she seems to be in this kind of liminal nether region where she may not even. She's obviously in California, but it doesn't seem like it's clear to her where in America she is. So I found that interesting to think about.
I think the other thing that's interesting to consider in relation to the fact that she does go and get the pregnancy test is that it does come after the scene where she first goes to the Bortz's house, and Bortz's wife specifically asks whether or not she has any children because of the way that she presents herself. Like, her appearance to his wife seems to signal the fact that she is likely in a similar life situation that she is. And the other interesting thing to consider in relation to that is this is one of the few male characters who does not make an attempt to take advantage of her. He does make an offer of, did you want to go see some dirty pictures? But it's literally related to the reason why she's there. And they do seem to present a happy image of a family that isn't, deeply disturbed or messed up or in permanent crisis. So I think there's also a part of that inclusion in the narrative that is Oedipa almost wishing that was the truth, as if having a child, or if she was pregnant by either Mucho or one of these other men that she's slept with, could potentially deliver her from her imprisonment to give her that image of happiness that she sees when she's at the Bortz's house, especially in light of the fact that his wife already thought that she was likely married with children.
I did interpret that section as possibly being concerning how the men in her life have been infantilized and how badly she's been treated by the men in her life. So rather than having children that are making her life hell, it's all these men who have made her life hell. Metzger has infantilized himself by running off with a teenager. The LSD seems to have kind of infantilized Mucho. Generally, the men in her life don't seem super mature or in touch with feminist ideals.
Yeah, I'd like to just express some gratitude for the character of Grace. She is remarkably normal and treats Oedipa a degree of respect and empathy that nobody else has come close to in this entire book. And she's just like she even essentially insults her, but it's entirely harmlessly. She means well. She's just trying to be a good neighbor to this complete stranger who's shown up at her door.
Yeah. The only other like female characters that Oedipus seems to have a friendship with are the ones from the very beginning of the book, which we never even really get to see, and even they are trying to ply her with dosed up party drinks in order to get her to buy Tupperware.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a weird. It was almost jarring to see Oedipa like be treated like a normal human being for once, because we've gone through, 200. Well, depending on the edition, yeah, we've gone through a significant portion of this book just watching her get beaten down by different people in different ways and used. She was basically a means to an end for almost every male character that was in her life. And to see her finally just have that moment of humanity was, it kind of stopped me for a second, and I had to go back and make sure I was reading it right. And yeah, it's I don't want to say it's weird, it's just jarring.
Mm-hmm. Additionally, heartbreaking part about it too is it probably makes her wonder if that was what her life could have been if she had gotten married to a man who actually cared for and loved her, and if they had had children together. Like, there's probably a part of her almost that wonders, if I had had a house in this neighborhood and then our kids maybe could be friends, like maybe this is the life that I could have had rather than the one that I ended up having.
Yeah, I mean, would she even have gone on this whole journey if she'd had kids or a kid? If because I think so much of this is her searching for meaning,
Mm-hmm.
which we'll kind of touch on that because I have some things I wanted to bring up on that end. But if things, like you said, Kate, had been different for her, and she had kids, she had a family, she had that meaning in her life, I think, just from the little time that we've spent with her, I don't think she would have cared about Pierce's little game. She would have gotten the call and been told, you're the executor of this estate. While she was all right, I don't really care. I've got other things in my life. Just, let someone else deal with it.
Yeah, and at the same time, you've got to wonder, as she drives into their neighborhood, Pynchon describes it as a riparian settlement in the style of Fangoso lagoons, which to me seems like a sign that, yes, they are in suburban paradise that is entirely controlled by people like Pierce. And later on in the book, later on in the chapter, you got to wonder if she isn't on some level considering that as a symbol of how much Bortz may or may not be controlled by Inverarity. And to add on to that, later in the same scene, when they're looking at the dirty pictures, Emery Bortz mentions that both he and Grace had been involved in the research of Wurfinger's works back in the day. And yet at this point, all she has time for is the kids. So is Pynchon saying that Oedipa wishes that she had that, but regardless shouldn't have had it? Or is it simply insulation, regardless of a positive or negative morality?
It's a good question. I think it comes down to your interpretation of what it is that Oedipa is looking for to give her meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that kind of speaks to the larger text in general. When in the this new essays on Crying of Lot 49 book I have, I don't remember which of the essays it is specifically, but it was mentioned that Oedipa is, in a sense, is the reader searching for meaning, and in this whole vast bizarre story where the meaning may or may not even be there, and what is there really comes down to what you get out of it yourself. It goes back to that whole, like, I think we talked about it maybe even in the intro episode, about the whole meaning of everything in art, in media that you consume is entirely subjective. So it's going to be different for everybody. And I thought that was a really interesting point that person made. I need to figure out which author it was in here, but that Oedipa is essentially a representation of us as a reader and how we act as a detective while we are reading these stories and pulling meaning out of all these different little things that may not have been put there to provide the meaning that we're getting, but based on our own life experiences and the things that we had experienced prior to engaging in this work determines how it comes out to us.
Yeah, and that reading even feeds back into the previous chapter's metaphor about feeding information to Maxwell's demon.
Which is quintessentially postmodern when you think about how the literary development occurred in modernism. This idea of there is truth, there are these modern things that we need to hold to in order to create a society. That the postmodern authors, for the most part, came along and said that isn't necessarily true. There are things that cause changes for every individual person. There are things that cause changes that can sometimes break down the very substance of the societies that these people in the generation before us created. So why not create art that allows people to experience those things differently, or that maybe has no answer? It's something that Pynchon plays with in all of his books, but in light of the essay that you mentioned, it would be especially interesting if that was the sort of frame that he started composing this book from, of creating a narrator or a protagonist who is more or less an insert for the reader to go on this journey and question what these things mean in light of their own experience, not just reading the book, but also their life experience. That sounds like a very, very well crafted and thought out essay.
Yeah, let me see if I can. I think it might be this one. If it's the one I'm thinking, the essay is called Borges and Pynchon: The Tenuous Symmetries of Art by W.A.S.T.E. Castillo. Let me see, because I had a bunch of stuff marked in here and I didn't plan on coming into it today. I was going to bring it up in the wrap-up episode, but let me see if I can find specifically where, because she also mentioned that idea as kind of just an idea of postmodernism in general. I mean, she has a line in here where she says she's talking about the plots and the codes that are dropped into the book, and that quote from earlier in the book that Driblet had about you can waste your life that way and never touch the truth. And she responds to that by saying such admonitions serve as both warning against and invitation for overreading of the novel.
Yeah, I was particularly thinking about with in this chapter the discussions of the historical Tristero, looking at how much that lined up with events of the play and then of the other fictional things which take place in this book throughout. I realized that there's almost a nested structure of symbols that exist within the facade of the book, within the play, etc. It just ends up all coming together to imply that if you're going to take any part of the smaller fictions in the novel as relevant to Oedipa's mystery, then you kind of have to invert Oedipa's mystery for yourself, leaving you as the sorter of facts once again.
Yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to that concept of Oedipa as a detective and us as a reader as a detective. You know, we're taking clues and signs and symbols and basically layering our own interpretation of those over it to create our overall interpretation of whatever it is we're consuming. Now, I don't think it's fair to say that there can be necessarily a wrong way to interpret it. I think you can certainly kind of get lost in the weeds a bit, you know, and overanalyze things and maybe make these logical leaps. I think with that essay that we talked about in chapter 3, the one about JFK, some of those those interpretations were a little bit of a stretch to me personally. But again, that kind of goes to, that idea of subjective analysis and how it plays into not just Pynchon's work. And I would even say not even necessarily in postmodernism work, but almost with any art at all. I certainly think there are books and stories and films where there is a kind of clearly intentioned message, and I myself tend to not enjoy those as much when it comes off kind of ham-fisted, or it's really trying to push its ideology or its message at you. But I think that's kind of what I really enjoy about postmodernism, like Kate was saying, like it kind of opens up so much more to allow you to get more out of it individually.
Yeah, and that's where you get into questions about death of the author as a philosophical argument for any form of art.
How about the other new character from the start of this chapter, Winthrop Tremaine? How do we all feel about him as a contrast to Grace?
Yeah. He's quite the opposite, that's for sure.
Is he just an amoral idiot, or is he villainous, I guess, is my question.
Well, okay, so I was thinking about this today, actually. With him specifically, kind of what you asked, like, is how are we to view him? Because to be honest, there are people like that today. There are, I don't want to say a lot, but I think more than one is a lot of people who actively collect and distribute Nazi memorabilia. It's such a weird interest to have, and I don't think it's one. I think a lot of times you can when people have these kind of esoteric interests, you can sometimes separate out. Okay, it's a weird thing to me, but it's fine. They're not hurting anybody. I think that's one of those few where I cannot separate what your interest is from its history. And I don't think that type of person was as prevalent in the 60s. Maybe they were, and I don't know. But I know they're still around today. And it's just weird to know that that's still a thing.
In the interest of defending our Nazi memorabilia collector fans, there's a big difference between collecting actual historical artifacts and producing swastika armbands for the sake of sale.
That's one thing that's kind of odd about this chapter and that part is that it does seem like it seems like he's producing like new SS uniforms and stuff. It doesn't seem like he's trafficking in World War II memorabilia he's more so like creating like Nazi cosplay stuff, like in the present tense rather than collecting stuff that was already made.
Yeah, that's absolutely what he's doing.
And it's hard to make a value judgment on not just him as a character, like Will asked, is he evil or just, something else entirely, without understanding why he's doing that or who they're being sold to. Because the only impression you get is that for whatever reason he is seeming to either have come across a fashion trend or is attempting to create one with what he's producing and selling. Which of course reminds me of the fact that a lot of the early like first wave punk bands wore swastika armbands or other specifically inflammatory clothing, but obviously that was still quite a ways away when this book was published. But there seems to be not enough information in relation to what he's doing and why to really make a value judgment on him as a character. He's certainly strange, and he's certainly probably at the very least racist, considering that he uses the N-word, but
frequently, yeah.
Yeah, but outside of that, there's not much that Pynchon gives the reader to go on.
Yeah. It is unclear if he's an opportunist or a Nazi himself. Yeah.
Yeah, and I had to wonder how long he's been doing this. Has he made enough success in doing what he's doing to keep the shop, or did he just get the shop and is kind of starting to launch into this? Was he doing something else and then kind of shifted over? Like, yeah, there's just so many questions that I want answers to, but I don't at the same time.
I think there is, I mean, his name is somewhat significant in that it seems to be a portmanteau of John Winthrop and John Tremaine. John Winthrop was a Puritan who came to America in the 17th century and was actually the one who sort of quoted or coined rather that term of a city upon a hill, and was pretty big for trying to evangelize like a fictional America that still has yet to exist, of this like beautiful promised land of equally positive people who are treated equally. And then John Tremaine is a character, a hero from a children's book about the American Revolution that was published in the 40s. The only real like connection to the greater part of the chapter that I can pick up on from a standpoint of his character's name is speaking about that potentially inherent discrepancy in the America that is so mythologized and the America that is actually heavily populated with all of these sort of strange characters running in and around the streets of it that are likely the exact opposite of what someone like those Puritan preachers was saying the country was going to be populated with, which does have some connection to the later portions of the book where Oedipa wonders about America as a whole in light of Inverarity's empire. But that's really as deep as I was able to go with his character.
I hadn't even thought about the Tremaine. I did think of Johnny Tremaine with that, but the John Winthrop connection, I hadn't. The name sounded familiar, but I didn't have any recollection of it until you went over it. That's interesting though.
Yeah, I had just interpreted his name as just kind of a portmanteau of generically like old money American names.
Yeah, I could see that. It has a very like that's a name that I would have expected to see more in like Against the Day.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it did make me wonder if there were. I completely forget, but it does make me wonder. It rang a bell of like character names in some of Pynchon's novels that were set, before the 1960s. But I'm not 100% that there are any characters that are actually similarly named.
I mean, then Winthrop. Not to get too far off on the topic, but the only thing or other character I can think off the top of my head that name and kind of character reminds me of is that he would be associated in some way with the vibes in Against the Day.
Yeah, Winthrop 5 is the adventuring son, I think.
Okay, yeah, that would be the bell that was ringing in my brain then.
I have to think. I don't remember off the top of my head, but that sounds right. I don't know. The only other real, I mean, so we met a couple other characters. Lauren Passerine, the auctioneer, kind of briefly pops up at the end, and then there's the Queda Chingado, which I'm in South Texas. I absolutely picked up on that. I used to work construction for my dad for a long time, so I learned a lot of Spanish words that I wasn't allowed to say at school. So I caught that one pretty quick. But the image of Emery Bortz drunkenly throwing bottles at birds just was hilarious to me. It had such a Big Lebowski vibe that I was just imagining. I can't even remember his name. The anarchist or the nihilist. I'm sorry, the nihilist who spends most of his time just like passed out in the pool. I just got those vibes of him just throwing empty beer bottles at birds. Well, let's get into the goings on in this chapter. Right off the bat, I kind of want to get everyone's feel on why at the beginning of the chapter Metzger gave up his executorship and ran off with a 15-year-old. The running off with a 15-year-old it's a concerning situation, obviously, but what left me wondering more was why he just abandoned all of this so suddenly and without notice.
Well, to me, it really, I don't know, it emphasizes the reading that we mentioned earlier, that Metzger's essentially inheritance from Inverarity was being given an opportunity to sleep with Oedipa, I guess. You know, he got that done
Yeah.
and he's out of there. Nothing else to do.
It maybe is an example of a rather than why a why not situation. I don't know.
See, I've been kind of reading this with the movie The Game in the back of my head. I don't know if any of y'all have seen. I think Will and I talked about this a while back during a break, but I don't know if any of y'all have seen that movie. But it's similar in the sense that there is this widespread, elaborate game, you know, that is set up for one of the characters, in which the line between it being a game and it being reality blurs so heavily that the viewer and the character just kind of lose track of how much of it is real and how much of it is all planned out. And it seems almost impossible to pull something like that off until you realize that with enough money and enough influence, which Pierce definitely has, it's really probably not that hard, especially if you keep it somewhat localized in sort of the area that we're talking about here. You could easily kind of sway the right people to do enough, and then, you know, let them know, hey, once this is done, you can bail, you're good. That was kind of my initial take on Metzger leaving, that he had done his part. He brought Oedipa to where she needed to get, and then he was free to bounce, and he did. That's one reading of it, I think. I there's certainly other ways to interpret that. That's just what I was thinking of with that movie in the back of my mind.
I think getting back to what Will had mentioned at the top of this episode about Metzger being essentially an infantilized individual, being obsessed with his child acting days, I think choosing to have him run away with a 15-year-old speaks to that same thing as well, that he can't be around his childlike days anymore. He can't continue to be that age any longer. And so when he is either given or takes an opportunity to run away with this 15-year-old, that puts him back in a position where he is surrounded by somebody in a similar state of mind. And he doesn't necessarily abandon his responsibility. He turns it over to another law firm to handle it. But that is sort of how I read that inclusion. But of course, my interpretation of whether or not Pierce is setting all of this up for Oedipa is likely different than yours.
I guess it kind of depends on what was the last scene that Metzger actually featured in. Was it sitting in the scope arguing with Fallopian?
I think it was. I think
Yeah,
you're
I
right.
think so.
Yeah, that's not helpful.
Well, yeah, and I see where your Kate and Will are coming from, and you know, again, there's no singular way to come away from all of this, and I kind of see. I was kind of trying to read it this time through with the lens of both possibilities, or not even both, but I guess all four really possibilities being the right. I don't even want to say the right one, but all four. I was kind of trying to view it as, you know, from all those different angles. But it kind of bouncing off of that idea and Pierce's influence in all of this, if it's there. The burning down of Zapp's bookstore. How are you taking that away from this? Or what are you taking away from that?
In my mind, the burning down of Zapp's bookstore and the subsequent deaths of other characters involved in the plot, and the anonymous man at the Greek way saying that his time is up, and all of that, to me recalls the idea that the secret post system is basically burning loose ends, that they've realized that there are people aware of them, and that these things are cropping up in multiple editions of, you know, paperback, hardcover, this version of this book, and this printing of this book, as well as all of these people being aware of it and trying to deliberately cull loose ends. It is easier to kill a bookstore owner by saying that his bookstore lit on fire to pass that off as an accident while also being able to destroy any remaining copies of the evidence that he may or may not have had.
I think it could also speak to, I mean, Cosa Nostra, the mob is included in this book. Pierce is shown as having a clear monetary association with the mob. And maybe I've just watched The Sopranos too much, but the cover story of the bookstore being burned down for insurance money. I mean, that could just be an example of, like Kate was saying, tying up loose ends and shutting down possible leaks and stuff. But I mean, it also could just be, as it's stated, a money grabbing scheme. But another example of kind of the Tristeros connection to more unsavory elements and kind of more countercultural criminal elements.
Yeah, I guess in the spirit of agreeing with your all four results are possibly true idea, Cody, I see it as kind of one of those things where it really doesn't matter why it happened. If it was arson, if it was just an accident, I mean, it's a bookshop, it could go up, who knows. If it was burning loose ends or getting revenge, I don't think it matters. To me, all that matters is that symbolically it says you are not going to find anything else. You're not going to be able to dig into the physical reality here. You're going to have to rely on these people like Bortz and Cohen, who you don't really trust. And even though she has reason to distrust Zaff later on in the chapter, I think it's just, here's a symbol of that happening alongside, what, two or three others in this chapter?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I mean, either way, you're right. There's a line in connection with this scene at the end of Oedipa's interaction with Winthrop Tremaine. Sorry, when she's already left and has that kind of, I think it's called a stairwell moment, where you kind of think of the clever response or the thing to do that you should have done after you've already gone away. And she says, "You're chicken," she told herself, snapping her seatbelt. "This is America. You live in it. You let it happen. Let it unfurl." That, there's a lot in that quote, I think, for me, more than just the idea that, she wanted to beat the shit out of him because he's an asshole. Just that idea of there's these vile people in the world that exist, and a lot of times, and a lot of times we just let them be. We have allowed it to happen and to gestate and to become what it becomes. And that's just kind of how we do things. We see these ugly things happen. We see these awful things that occur, and most people just don't really do anything. And they just kind of sit there and they watch it and they move on with their lives. And there should be a sense of responsibility taken in those situations, but there never really is. But then we're always quick to turn back and say, well, this shouldn't be like that. But we let it get there. And I think that kind of speaks to the downfall of everything that the 60s was working towards. We had this movement, this push towards actually changing something and doing something. And I can't say, none of us were there at the time, but the people who were there, who were pushing forward and who were there, not necessarily on the front lines, so to speak, but were there in the background and were there supporting different things in different ways, just watched it collapse and watched it happen and then moved on with their lives.
It also reminds me of the Vietnam War. One thing that I'm not 100% that all of our listeners are going to know is that, I mean, the Vietnam War was pretty much the first heavily televised war.
Mm-hmm.
On the nightly news, there would have been combat footage. And I mean, in the preceding chapter, in chapter 5, we do get a mention of the business executive who wants to set himself on fire in the style of Vietnamese Buddhist monks, which, that would have also made the news, would have been in the newspaper and stuff. Like people, like, I mean, to kind of contrast, people in Vietnam to protest the war are setting themselves on fire. And then, there's probably a lot of Americans during this time who were just kind of living their life, didn't go to protest, maybe didn't directly support the war, but were paying taxes and stuff. I think a year or two after this book came out, Pynchon did sign a petition that I think was placed as an advertisement in major newspapers, where he said he wasn't going to pay any tax increases that would contribute to the war in Vietnam. I think you get where I'm going with that. There probably was a sense that a lot of people were just kind of letting it happen, not directly protesting, not really doing anything other than just living their lives, while all this horrible stuff, like the My Lai massacre and all this horrible stuff was happening in Vietnam. Everyone was just kind of letting it happen, paying taxes, and just, living their life.
Yeah, and to continue that, I mean, immediately after saying, "This is America, you live in it, you let it happen, let it unfurl," Oedipa's next step is to, quote unquote, hunt for Volkswagens. That's not gonna stop any Nazis. And, it's a fun, it's a fun little joke for the narrator.
Yeah.
But it's also, I mean, we've seen time and time again, Oedipa and other people do these little acts of rebellion that don't help anything, and in the long term help strengthen the control of them.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think that is, excuse me, I think that's something that capital T, they kind of feed on, or at least need to keep going, is those little moments of people thinking like, oh, I'm doing this rebellious thing, I'm whatever the case may be. And like you said, it's not doing anything, and if it is doing anything, it's probably feeding more into what they're trying to do, but giving you that sort of feel good sensation of doing something in opposition of it. The other quote, kind of not necessarily quote, prosy quote that we do later on, but plot wise point that I wanted to bring up is at the end of, for me, it's page 125, when she's talking to Bortz and he tells her, she just learns about Driblet dying, and there's that kind of internal monologue where she says, "They're stripping from me," she said subvocally, "feeling like a fluttering curtain in a very high window, moving up to then out over the abyss. They are stripping away one by one my men." I don't know if y'all came away with the same imagery I had, but the first place my mind went was back to the Bordando El Manto Terrestre painting, of that idea of being back in the tower, just that being high up in looking out over the nothingness that's out there. To me, that kind of was Oedipa jumping back into that and being reminded of that isolation that she had felt and has been feeling, growing more and more since the start of this book.
Yeah, absolutely, especially considering that the rest of that paragraph goes on to describe what's happened to all of the other men in her life beyond just Driblet, where it truly shows the fact that she is being pushed into isolation, especially because, like we talked about already on this episode, she doesn't have any female friends really. There's the ones that are not named at the beginning of the book, and then she meets Grace in this chapter, but otherwise she's been surrounded by men, and now they're all gone.
And to kind of bounce off of that idea and kind of back up a little bit and look at the whole of all of this, as far as if we kind of go back to the idea that Pierce has a hand in this, whether it's directly by setting all of this up or just his death sparking the beginning of this journey. In that new essays on Crying of Lot 49, there's one of the essays in here, excuse me, it's called Towards a Schizotext, Paranoia as Semiotic Regime in the Crying of Lot 49 by John Johnston. I mentioned this particular essay before as it related, because I find the semiotic interpretation of this to be really the most interesting to me, just because it has that whole idea of subjectiveness and everything. But he says, not accidentally, Peirce's name evokes the name of the American founder of semiotics, C.S. Peirce. Appropriately, he seems to stand behind, to, quote, figure, as it were, one of the novel's central motifs, that the dead never really go away or disappear, but persist as signs. And that whole idea of her being back in the tower and feeling that again made me kind of think about that, and how it keeps going back to Peirce. And we'll get to that again later, obviously, because we get an idea later on of how much Peirce really controls. But I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on that concept.
I'm sorry, what specific concept?
That let me go back to that specific line, because it was, hold on a sec. That the dead never really go away or disappear, but persist as signs. If everything, all these signs that Oedipa is seeing along the way are really just sort of reminders of Peirce throughout, all of it. Obviously, there's, they're representations of what they are to her, but they're also kind of going back to just being about Peirce.
Yeah, I see that as a valid understanding. I don't have anything to add on to it, but that makes sense to me.
It is certainly a big part of the book. I mean, going back to the scene about dandelion wine, there's literally a line in there that says that even the dead persist into a bottle of wine. So there is certainly this idea present through the whole book of people having a transitive property into the things that they surrounded themselves with or were. Peirce is certainly all over the book, from the companies that he controlled or the land that he bought or the things that he built. But I think whether you have an interpretation that Peirce purposely set Oedipa up to go on this journey, or if your interpretation is that his death ended up unintentionally leading her on this journey, they are all still signs that make up in augury of Peirce, for sure. I think that Oedipa likely would not have cared to look into any of this if it didn't have something related to Peirce, because Peirce was the closest thing that she ever got to feeling like the night of deliverance had come for her. And so as a result, she feels an additional burden to track those things down. I think that's an absolutely correct interpretation of not only why those symbols are inextricably tied to him, but also why it is that she takes such a keen interest and allows it to fundamentally sort of reformat her brain as she goes down this path.
So we also get, I've noticed this, I don't want to call it a motif necessarily, but there's a part here where she's talking to Bortz, and the line specifically is, too much sunlight shone on the bottles, silent all around them. And if I'm not mistaken, the same kind of thing happened in Yoyodyne, where she was kind of overwhelmed by the brightness of the lights, and simultaneously I don't think in that situation it was a silence. It was, if I remember correctly, it was that there was a lot of noise going on. I don't think there was, though. I have to think about that now, but anyways, that overwhelming light seems to come in at these certain moments for her, and it seems like it's a recurring, image that has popped up a few times. There was another mention of it with the crystals, I think, when she was talking with Mr. Thoth. I'm not really sure how I'm interpreting that, other than it seems to be these moments of Oedipa's, I don't want to call it recognition necessarily, but something is coming upon her, and it's creating these moments where she's having this brightness illuminated onto her.
Yeah, I think you would look to when those moments come, and you'd find that they're seems to be a correlation between that and moments of epiphany, or moments of epiphany that come slightly before or after it. Because realistically, from a thematic perspective, much of the book itself is about epiphany as a mind state, or as a position to be in. So I think it's likely a flourish that Pynchon is engaging in order to signal sort of a further evolution or change in Oedipa as she continues to navigate what she's looking to find out.
Yeah, and speaking of evolution of Oedipa as a character, I find very important to this chapter the fact that she has started to wall herself off from the curiosity that has gotten her to this point. And, it's left as an exercise to the reader as to whether she should have held on to that curiosity and persevered, or whether she's right to just stop looking at a certain point. But it seems quite fundamental to who she is and this sense of alienation that this chapter exhibits. That she starts out calling Driblet, going over to see this random person, Emery Bortz, who edited a collection of plays this one time. And by the end of it, all that she can bring herself to do is to go to an auction.
I think that speaks somewhat to her inability to be a sorter of reality, going back to the Maxwell's demon analogy, and how that idea of sorting really is not only just Oedipa's job, but also the job of the reader of the book. But it also, your statement there, Will, reminded me of the end of the first chapter, which, if I can just go back and re-indulge the listener in, the end of the first chapter finishes by saying, having no apparatus except gut fear and female cunning to examine this formless magic, to understand how it works, how to measure its field strength, count its lines of force, she may fall back on superstition, or take up a useful hobby like embroidery, or go mad, or marry a disc jockey. If the tower is everywhere, and the night of deliverance is no proof against its magic, then what else? I think that is obviously a fairly prophetic line in terms of how the rest of the book plays out, but I think it's also a statement of the reality that Oedipa ends up in. The tower is not a locale that she's stuck in. It isn't something that's coming from one specific person or one specific place. It's everywhere. And even when she stumbles across some sort of conspiracy or some sort of opportunity to sort out meaning from her experience, even that proves to just be within the tower, because its walls are larger than she thought. And the night of deliverance that she thought would come to take herself away from it didn't work. And so in the case of that, the night of deliverance is gone. The last thing that the night of deliverance may have left for her or given to her doesn't work. She's still not able to sort things out. She's still not able to be the sensitive required in order to make the demon function. She sort of is left with no choice but to allow the walls of the tower to take place as the primacy of how she sees the world around her. She's stuck with no other option but to wall herself off.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. Both of y'all are spot on, I think. So if we go back to the idea of reading, not only us reading it as a detective, but Oedipa being a detective, there was a couple of times in this particular chapter, and I may have missed it in other chapters, where she's really focused on reading the faces of people she's talking to. At this part in the story, when she's talking to Bortz, there's that line about Bortz's face stayed neutral, and then later on, I think it's page 137. She was talking to, it might have been Genghis Cohen. She's again reading these faces and trying to parse out, whether this person is being truthful to her or if they're hiding something from her about whatever's going on. And I kind of, in thinking about it in that sort of semiotics and interpreting signs kind of way, I think that kind of speaks to us as the readers, again, just kind of looking for these little nuanced changes in things to see if we can pick up on what might be there.
That did kind of remind me of the phone call she makes to the Greek Way, where she identifies herself as Arnold Snarb, and seems to kind of desperately try to level with the unnamed guy that she talked to, where she seems to, I forget what the exact words are, but she seems to really be like, like just wanting him to cut the shit and stop fucking with her. And it doesn't seem to work, but she does seem to have reached a stage of desperation where she's willing to make it clear to other people, perhaps, that she's not doing so hot mentally, and that she's really starting to question her reality and question, the what's going on around her in a very like deep and perhaps unhealthy way.
It's in the just prior to that, and she says in that conversation, I just went driving blind on the freeway drunk. So it's not a joke for me. And together with the symbol of the tower walls closing in, I think it would be to ignore the fact suicide has throughout this entire book, but this is the chapter where she makes multiple attempts, and there's very little that I can imagine a real life Rapunzel who never has her Prince Charming climb her hair to do, except for eventually try to leave the tower through her own devices.
And I think there is an interpretation, I think, in the ending with her choosing to show up to the auction in person, especially with the inclusion of the line where Pynchon says that she seems to interpret other people as expecting that she wouldn't have shown up. And in her not going out of her way to finally like confront the person that she thinks is there from Trastero to buy the postage stamps, and instead just waits to see what it is, that it is possible, there is an interpretation, I should rephrase, that is her electing to try and leave herself. That at that point, she's no longer necessarily following down the same track anymore. She's exhausted the track, and so instead now she's just willing to examine things as they come. And whether or not that's going to lead her to a successful climb down from that tower, or whether or not it's going to continue to keep her in the same loops that she's going through, I think that is an interpretation that you can come away from with the ending. But I think the ending is largely left deliberately ambiguous as to whether or not the reader is going to come away with the thought that she will ever make it out, or if she's just going to continue to stay there and just allow whatever happens to happen. It's a very interesting ending for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I think it's almost like it's a last act of defiance for her. This kind of idea that, I've done everything I can possibly try to do to get to whatever any of this is, and by showing up, it's kind of that last fuck you to whoever it is that's in control at this point. But there's also, I took the ending as, in a way, it's haunting, because you do have that idea that she's finally kind of doing this thing for herself and gotten to the point where she can allow herself to not necessarily be controlled by the people who were controlling her. But at the same time, she gets there, and yeah, there is that idea of, we didn't think you'd be here, but the person, I think it's the auctioneer who's mentioned as having that kind of attitude, it also smiles at her, and there's a sort of creepiness to that in my reading of it, of like, okay, well, if you want to be here, you're going to find out some shit that you probably don't want to find out. And I think, just to me, that adds a sort of haunting element to that whole ending.
Yeah,
especially describing the auctioneer as a priest.
Yeah, the really religious, like, the arms out, like,
mm-hmm.
it just had a really I don't know, just a really creepy, eyes wide shut type of thing.
Well, we can't forget that this isn't the first time that she's decided to go off the rails and search for her own. I mean, that was the feature of chapter 5, really, was her deciding to go look around for herself away from any of these influences. And so to me, it's extra haunting because it seems like it's just going to be another instance of her finding the chalk drawn post horn in the ground. She's just going to keep on searching, and she's going to keep on being inspired to think that she's onto something. And it's almost a taunting of, you think you have a hint, but all it ever does is lead you down more wandering paths.
Kind of
Yeah.
a chasing the goal line that keeps moving away from you kind of thing. Yeah.
And that's certainly my personal interpretation that I would subscribe to based on the ending of the book.
And I think it's interesting. I wanted to go back to what Luke was saying, specifically mentioning that scene where she called the Greek way and spoke with the unnamed member of IA. I may be looking too into this. The line when he says, "I was in the little boy's room." Initially, I read that and was just kind of like, that's a weird thing to say. And then I got to thinking about it, and I had to go back and look at it. And the person, when she initially arrives in that scene, back in that chapter, the person who put the Arnold Snarb name badge on her was described as having a cherubic face. And it made me wonder if that was Arnold Snarb. If he put the name tag on, or the name badge on her, because eventually, you know, that happens. She kind of wanders through the crowd before she makes her way into the bar, and then she meets up with him. And if I, you know, again, I'm looking at this through the idea of, you know, I'm trying to take all these angles in and see this, but in specifically looking at it as something that Pierce set up, you know, this could easily be someone that was there to kind of guide her in a specific direction and you know, keep pushing her towards where she's supposed to go.
I mean, the text does say that it's Arnold Snarb who puts the name badge on her, because he specifically says, "Let me pin this on you. I just left."
Right. I think what I'm wondering if he is the same person that she ends up speaking to in the bar, the unnamed guy that she ends up talking to.
The only reason I'm hesitant to take that as, I don't know, symbolic, is that she does see Arnold Snarb's face, and that she'd be anonymous. They're
That's true. Yeah, she never makes
she's-
that connection.
Yeah, that's all. But I
No,
think
that's a
there
good
might
point.
be something there, though, with the little boy's room and the cherubic mention. That makes sense. What do you all make of the of his foreboding last line to Oedipa, though?
Oh, it's too late before the he either hangs up or it gets disconnected.
Yeah.
I honestly, I could see both sides of that. I could very easily see it being him saying, like, you're in too deep. I can't get any deeper into this without something happening to me. But I can also see it as just, you know, it's literally too late. It's whatever o'clock in the morning. I don't have time for this shit. And then either she didn't have enough in the, you know, because we're talking about payphones at this point. She didn't have enough money in there to keep the call going, or he hung up on his end, or it just disconnected. It's one of those things where I think it comes down to how you're reading the story, you know, at that time.
I mean, within an interpretation of all of these different things happening as Tristero sort of burning loose ends, it's entirely possible that because the IA was using the muted post horn as their symbol, that he had started hearing about other members of the organization being dead, or something had happened, and he assumed that he was going to be next. That could be part of it. It could also be that in relation to suicide being mentioned all over the chapter, to your point earlier, Will, it could also be that he's chosen to commit suicide finally, given that that's such a deeply integral part of that organization that he happens to be a part of. And so he's no longer interested in talking about anything or in having somebody talk him off the ledge or potentially make him change his mind. It's hard to pin down what that specific meaning may come from, and in terms of, like we've sort of been talking about, of the reader being Oedipa and trying to sort out fact from fiction and the meaning from the symbolism of the book. It could also be something that Pynchon put in there to invite readers to come up with what they think that means in light of the interpretation that they're going for, or to choose what that means, or to sort it into one category or another.
It is interesting that he says it's too late, then Oedipa asks for me, and then he says for me, which can be interpreted a few different ways. So we've already kind of gone over, but it is interesting that he's so evasive, and I do think it could be a reference to him killing himself. It could be a reference to him falling in love with somebody, so it's too late for him to go back on it. It could be one of those kind of in the same style as Driblet. I'm more thinking of like detective movies, detective novels, where a witness will like be killed, for what they know or something. Maybe she was too direct with him.
Yeah, and they know it's going to happen. Like they're aware that like someone's coming for him. Yeah,
yeah. There's a few different ways you can interpret it.
And I think and we've talked about this. That's one of my favorite aspects of Pynchon's novels is you can, with almost all of them, you can approach them from different angles and read them almost as not necessarily different stories, but kind of like the same story, but enveloped in a different sort of atmosphere. You can read it as this conspiracy thriller, or as a detective novel, or as almost a horror story of this woman just being lost in this labyrinthian conspiracy of symbols and weird people and things. Like there's so many different ways to come at this that it almost allows for endless rereadings and reinterpretations.
It is interesting to read a book that purposely has no solution, which recalls The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler, where that's a significantly more straightforward novel when compared to The Crying of Lot 49. But, famously, when they were making the film adaptation of it, I don't remember if it was the screenwriter or the director, they called Raymond Chandler and they said, well, who is responsible for the murder? Who killed the person who sets off this entire plot's motion? And Raymond Chandler's response was, I don't know.
Yeah, I love that.
It seems like there's a possibility that is very deliberate in how Lot 49 was crafted, given Pynchon's affection and real reverence for detective and hard-boiled fiction, because there are so many different ways to interpret not just this particular part of this book, but most of it, and nobody's going to read it and come away with the exact same interpretation unless they've sort of colluded on an understanding with somebody else. And the same would be true for The Big Sleep. You could come away with any number of interpretations as to why what happens in that book happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and just to complete the list, I guess, of interpretations of the Call to the Greek Way. I mean, I just interpret that I was in a little boy's room. The men's room was full, and it's too late for me. Like as literally just, I'm drunk as hell. I'm gonna say I went to the little boy's room. Oh, I'm drunk. That sounds funny. The men's room was full. It just, I mean, it could be all of these things. It could be entirely banal. It could be the ramblings of a drunk. It could be some guy who just felt like screwing with someone who he thinks is deranged. It could be a conspirator.
And the inherent genius in that decision is that likely Oedipa would have the exact same conversation with herself that we are all having right now.
Yep. Absolutely. I want to touch on, well, I'd say touch on, I kind of want to go over, because I think it's a pretty important part of the chapter, but also of the book in general. The part of this chapter that kind of discusses the formation of Trastero and its history, as Oedipa puts it together based on everything that she has, really. Just like when I was reading this at this time, certain things kind of started clicking in different places, and I don't know if it was because of thinking on the JFK article that we had read earlier, or that I had read, or that we talked about. I kind of started thinking about this as it related to the Cuban Revolution, because there was parts of it, and I could be completely overshooting this, and I'm absolutely in no way an expert on the Cuban Revolution. I have a very, very base knowledge of it, but initially in talking about the junta of Calvinist fanatics that kicked off the sort of formation of it, it reminded me of the sort of rise of communism that came with the Cuban Revolution and the overthrowing of I can't remember the president's name at the time, but there's the mention of guerrilla warfare, there's the mention of failed assassination attempts, and what is his name? Hincart is referred to as the disinherited, and Castro was often called the hero of the disinherited. So all these little things, as I'm reading that, were kind of pushing this idea of this kind of mirroring the socio-political climate of the 60s and of the Cuban Revolution specifically, because that whole incident, which led to the Bay of Pigs, ultimately led to the JFK assassination, because all these things are sort of tied together, even if there's no, provable threads between, who had connections to what that led to the JFK assassination. I still thought it was really interesting in reading the formation of Trastero as a sort of mirror of the Cuban Revolution. I don't know if y'all have any opinions on that, but that's just something that came to me.
This is maybe a bit off topic, but I did note that whenever we see Fallopian in the scope, the way he's described, he has a beard. Yeah, it does. Besides the fact that he's not wearing a hat, his outfit did kind of remind me of ways that I've seen Che and Castro presented. Mm-hmm. And it does seem like he has kind of turned into a revolutionary of some sort.
Well, she even mentions about how he looks like he was training people up in the mountains.
Yeah, that seems like a dead giveaway. I do think that there are aspects, I think, of even in the Cuban Revolution. I think that Castro and his forces were centered in the Cuban highlands, and that's and that's where they did a lot of their training and were based from, I want to say. So that does seem to have come up with the scene with Fallopian.
Yeah, he's even described as wearing a Cuban uniform, if I can find it real quick.
Even just the fact that he's suddenly surrounded by women does seem to kind of give him that kind of revolutionary aura. And he does say it's a revolutionary secret at one point.
Yeah, because he's described, she found Mike Fallopian a couple weeks into raising a beard, wearing button-down olive shirt, creased fatigue pants minus cuffs and belt loops, 2-button fatigue jacket, no hat. It's almost a dead ringer for either Castro or Guevara, because they both kind of dressed similarly at the time. Castro really kind of dressed that way most of his life.
Yeah, and then the final line of the scene is she left him in his modified Cuban ensemble to watch watching the floor, waiting for his broads to come back.
That does seem, because they're the CIA, because he's so conservative, and that there is a link between. This is obvious considering that Castro and Che were both leftists, but there is a link between anti-Castro forces, anti-Castro people in the U.S. and the Republican Party being conservative, and also the CIA, which is generally viewed as a conservative entity. So it does seem to be perhaps a link to all that. I agree.
Ironically, I actually, when reading this chapter through, for some reason felt very strongly that I was being less and less convinced of the JFK assassination reading of this book. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff there that you can get into, but it just, for some reason, something about this chapter really made me think, yeah, but that's probably a red herring.
It's the first chapter in a while without a reference to three assassins. I think I think chapter 3, chapter 4, and chapter 5 all have different references to groups of three people who are violent and kill people. Which I'm not exactly sure how that relates to the Cuban, or not the Cuban, the Kennedy assassination. Besides perhaps like shooters on the knoll, on the grassy knoll, but I've never necessarily seen the number 3 linked with the shooters on the grassy knoll. But it also, like, because I do think I'm correct in that the 3 preceding chapters all have references to groups of assassins that are 3 people.
I think so. That sounds right.
The number 3 isn't necessarily associated with shooters from the grassy knoll, but it could be associated with the 3 tramps that were found in the rail yard behind the grassy knoll. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So I kind of also wanted to get everyone else's insight on that history and how much stock you can put into it, given that Oedipa's basically cobbled it together from a number of sources that may or may not be reliable.
I think the most interesting thing apart in that history that I find most interesting, I should rephrase too, is that it seems almost that there are 2 Tristeros, where there's the historical one that she does cobble together from multiple sources that existed in Europe. And then it almost, my reading of it anyway, seems as though when the few couriers came over to America and started to expand into an organized system here, that it almost took on a different shape and one that was much darker than what it was in Europe. And that the historical Tristero is probably accurate to my reading. I feel like there's no reason to doubt that it isn't, but that there was some sort of evolution that happened over the course of it being involved in America, which could get further into the overall themes of the chapter as America being a place that is different from its outward facing ideals or morals, that developed into this sort of subversive group that caters to mail services for revolutionary and underground organizations.
One thing I found interesting about that section is as it relates to Gravity's Rainbow, because the Thurn and Taxis family, or whatever that whole entity is obviously it's a real historically based mail service, and Rilke, who I'm a pretty big fan of, wrote his Duino elegies in the castle of one of the Thurn and Taxis, like one of their female relatives in the early 1900s, and the Duino elegies feature pretty heavily in Gravity's Rainbow. So I do think this is. I don't think it's a stretch to think that a lot of that part and the history that he goes over does seem to be maybe an outgrowth of his research for Gravity's Rainbow, because I think it is pretty well documented that Pynchon does perhaps an excessive amount of historical research. So I thought it was interesting to think about. We've gone over the fact that Lot 49 was written concurrently with Gravity's Rainbow, and I do think that those two kind of dovetail in that way.
I agree with Kate's intuition that there seems to be a kind of a twofold meaning of the Tristero, whatever the historical reliability of any of the information may be. But it's hard to kind of get a sense of the American Tristero, because yeah, they're giving their employees crash courses in Siouan and Athabascan dialects, and they're still essentially playing the same game of screwing with the Pony Express and Wells Fargo and all of them. But to what end? Have they swallowed the poison pill of the spite that they were founded upon, or is it something deeper than that?
It could also be that the whoever started the American branch of it, so to speak, had revolutionary aims themselves, similar to the sort of reasonings behind why it was founded in Europe. And then as time went on and it failed to provide any sense of a real revolution, it just became simply a mail carrier system for revolutionaries. It's a good question. There's very little information actually given to the reader about that American half of the organization.
Yeah, because it goes from, I mean, if you kind of just broadly look at the history of it, it seems to kind of start as a, if I'm not mistaken, as like a Calvinist regime, military regime, and then just becomes a loose communication network for anarchists by the time it gets over into the U.S. But I think you're right, Kate, in that it definitely took on a more sinister sort of agenda, I guess, when it came here. And I don't know if there's more to that as far as, as it relates to like American history and the coming over of European settlers to America. There may be something in there maybe that I just didn't pick up on, but you're definitely right that they get much darker when they come over.
Yeah, I suppose the line that most resonates, I guess, if you're going to dig into what the American branch does or symbolizes, would be the last line, kind of in that, her recapitulation of what she understands about the schism, of their entire emphasis now towards silence, impersonation, opposition masquerading as allegiance. And that seems to kind of imply that they are acting as operatives for the purpose of manifest destiny, while disguising themselves as raiding native tribes.
Which gets into the concept of what W.A.S.T.E itself actually stands for. We await Silent Tristero's empire, whatever that empire may be.
Yeah, and the question, I guess, is the masquerade towards allegiance of those tribes, or is it opposition masquerading as allegiance to that manifest destiny? And at that point in time, it was operating in some subtle way as nail strips in the way of that process, or is it simply another branch of that process? Going back to what you'd said, Luke, about the relations to Gravity's Rainbow, Winthrop Tremaine's sweatshop of black employees seems to me a bit resonant of the Schwarzkommando. And I wonder which came first.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I hadn't made that connection, but I can absolutely see that now. So to go back to the kind of multiple interpretation angles of all of this, there's a what I think is kind of a crucial line that points in that direction as far as the idea that this can be viewed, not just this, but almost anything can be viewed in different ways depending on the person. When she goes back and is talking to Fallopian, he tells her, maybe we haven't found them yet, said Fallopian, or maybe they haven't approached us, or maybe we are using W.A.S.T.E only it's a secret. Then as electronic music began to percolate into the room, but there's another angle too. She sensed what was going on, what he was going to say, and began reflexively to grind together her back molars, a nervous habit she developed in the last few days. Has it ever occurred to you, Oedipa, that somebody's putting you on, that this is all a hoax, maybe something Inverarity set up before he died? I think that just kind of really hammered home the multifacetedness of this whole story, in that there's not really a clear way to see all of this. That it as we've been saying, it's all subjective, and it all depends on the parts of it that you're picking up and kind of running with.
There's so much unclear in this novel. Something that's occurred to me over the last few days is you would think that they're considering the fact that this whole novel centers around Oedipa's ex-boyfriend dying and her having to execute his will. You would think that there would be a funeral scene where, you know what I'm saying, where you would think that would be part of the novel. I think I have seen. I mean, I don't necessarily want to condone this view, but it's certainly possible, and I don't really know what this little fan theory would really add to a reading of the novel, but it's certainly possible that Pierce isn't even dead. We never see a body. I think I've seen somebody theorize that the buyer at the very end of the novel could be Pierce himself. Which I don't, like I said, I don't know what that really adds to a possible reading of the novel, but it is interesting to think about.
It is, and I'm glad that we don't get any kind of confirmation of that at the end. I think that would have really, would have really kind of sunk the ship, so to speak. I think that ambiguity is vital to everything that happens in this, because the idea that Pierce is dead is kind of the driving force for Oedipa. Like, even in this chapter, she kind of comes to terms with the fact that he is dead. But like you said, it's never explicitly known that he is. It's just told to her that he is. She doesn't go to a funeral. There's no, verification. She never even sees like a death certificate. So we're all just kind of bought into the idea that he is without having any kind of actual proof for it.
Well, practically speaking, to execute a will, you do have to have at least one copy of the death certificate on hand. But that doesn't mean she saw it. But I like the idea now, and I'm glad it's not there. But I think it would be a very funny, just slight shift in our useful timeline if Thomas Pynchon had somehow written, instead of she sat back to witness the crying of Lot 49, he'd said something along the lines of, and she saw like a reflection of what might have been Pierce's face, just a similar, an ambiguous statement of seeing someone who looked like Pierce in the auction room. Despite, and like you said, it doesn't add anything to the book if you have that. But it would be the funniest thing, I think, for this book to end on such a stupid.
Maybe noticing something on, like, she sees all the backs of everyone's head, and maybe noticing some, like a mole that Pierce had on his neck or something like that. Something.
Yeah, something.
Picked up on.
Even somebody that could be Pierce's relative, perhaps, or something.
Yeah. Oh, that's his brother. Yeah, it's. I think with regards to the ending, I think with a lot of other authors, I think the temptation to do something like that, to have that sort of mic drop moment of Pierce being there, or something to give you that sort of resolution, I think would be too tempting for a lot of other authors to do. And I'm glad it didn't happen here, because I think the ambiguity is important. But I do like the idea that there is somewhere in an alternate universe, there is that moment where Pierce walks in and has that sort of gotcha moment.
I can't help but imagine the way back in the day, ye olde Rage Comics, the troll face. Just Pierce sitting there grinning at Oedipa.
Yeah. Did we have anything else we want to go over plot-wise? Or do we want to jump into quotes?
We can jump into quotes.
So, one that was funny to me, just a goofy little thing, was Miles referring to Metzger as your young man when he was talking to Oedipa. Miles has such a stupid amount of confidence for a 16-year-old hotel manager that it just never ceases to make me laugh. He's a creep. Let's not forget the fact that he's actively handing out keys to people's rooms to let his friends watch them have sex. But shit like that just makes me laugh. Like, just your young man, ran off with our drummer's girlfriend. Like, it's so stupid.
Yeah, I see it as kind of a part of his evolution over time of going from a relatively normal Californian guy who wants to be a rock star to someone who's just slowly started using exclusively British slang, but in his, entirely American accent and context.
Yeah.
Even the phrase he says the lad is crackers with grief, which, if I'm not mistaken, is British slang.
Yeah. The other one that I thought was just kind of funny in a pinch on pun way was when he talks about Bort's exfoliating the mere words so lushly, and just knowing Emery Bort's and exfoliating, like it's just such it's a almost a dad joke level of pun that just I love that kind of humor, and I'm glad that it exists and that I was able to pick up on it. But
I think also in that scene, another quote that I find pretty funny in relation to talking about Metzger running away with a 15-year-old is that the Paranoids not only write a song about it, which seems absurd enough on its own, but also has a reference to Lolita.
yes,
Yeah, that was another quote for a humorous perspective that's really good in this chapter.
Well, so continually throughout his books from this point on, Pynchon does, and we've discussed it a little bit in the past, make a big deal out of the effect that Lolita had on culture, and or whether or not it did have an effect on culture, or if it just symbolized, the that type of stuff happening. And in this book, which is so full of, what is the word? Subliminal discussions of misogyny and patriarchy, to have this very elegant demonstration of the very stupid trend in our society of having these, wealthy middle-aged men date down in age, felt a little bit more meaningful than just as a joking reference to his former teacher.
It is.
Oh yeah, no, I agree.
It's come up a little bit in my my discussions about Pynchon, just kind of over the course of my life, that the literary precedent that Lolita gives Pynchon is, Pynchon does include a lot of, especially in this book, but this and Gravity's Rainbow, and perhaps in other books, I kind of forget, but he is shown a lot. There's a lot of pedophilia type stuff, and one thing that some people like, the Lolita depicts pedophilia, but it doesn't condone pedophilia, and it does seem important to Pynchon that distinction of being able to depict something without necessarily everyone thinking that you're saying it's a good thing, which I think was important to Pynchon's development as a writer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even choosing to mention Lolita in that section while describing Metzger running away with a 15-year-old is a very purposeful reference to illustrate to the reader just what sort of a dynamic is going on there. That it isn't something innocent or fun or in any way positive. It's deeply troubling, even though he's making light of it by using these lyrics from a Beatles ripoff band.
I gotta say that those lyrics might be the best lyrics of the book.
Oh, for sure.
Oh yeah, completely. Sure. It's a real example of his high magic of low puns.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that for me, a lot of my favorite quotes in this chapter come from the very lyrical writing style that he engages in the book, not from a songwriting perspective, but just from the actual composition of the prose. And there's so many good ones that you can pull from when Oedipa's thinking about what Pierce's inheritance really means and all of the things that he was involved in. But specifically the quote, "She walked on a stretch of railroad track next to the highway. Spurs ran off here and there into factory property. Pierce may have owned these factories too, but did it matter now if he'd owned all of San Narciso? San Narciso was a name, an incident among our climactic records of dreams and what dreams become among our accumulated daylight. A moment's squall line or tornado's touchdown among the higher, more continental solemnities, storm systems of group suffering and need, prevailing winds of affluence. There was true continuity, San Narciso had no boundaries. No one knew yet how to draw them. She had dedicated herself weeks ago to making sense of what Inverarity had left behind, never suspecting that the legacy was America. It's not only such a beautifully written section of it, but also the further elucidation of the paragraphs afterwards really get to a lot of the stuff that Pynchon wrote over the course of his career and clearly mattered a lot to him. But The Crying of Lot 49 really stands out to me as a book that is written with such beautiful prose. Not that his other books are not, but the amount of really amazing sentence structures and imagery that he engages in such a slim volume of a novel is continually impressive to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of piggyback on that, I have towards the end, I have a little section marked that's like you mentioned, Kate. Like there is such a lyricism to a lot of his prose, and I think that was one of the things that really brought me into his work more when I started reading his stuff, was that I could just get lost in his sentences in such a way that I couldn't really with other authors. And it's not to dismiss other authors' writing style. Like, everyone writes in their own way, and it's great. There's just something about his sentence structure and the way he's putting together these paragraphs and these images that is so just beautiful at times that it's hard to believe that this can come from someone almost I don't want to say effortlessly, because obviously he puts a lot into it, but just to be able to do it, I kind of have this envy that I wish I could be able to do that. But anyways, to get to the quote that I want to bring up, it's towards the end of the book in general. It's on the last couple of pages, and it's kind of in the middle of a longer section, but it says, "For it was now like walking among the matrices of a great digital computer, the zeros and ones twinned above, hanging like balanced mobiles right and left, ahead, thick, maybe endless. Behind the hieroglyphic streets, there would either be a transcendent meaning or only the earth. In the songs Miles, Dean, Serge, and Leonard sang was either some fraction of the truth's numinous beauty, as Mucho now believed, or only a power spectrum. Tremaine, the swastika salesman's reprieve from Holocaust, was either an injustice or the absence of a wind. The bones of the GIs at the bottom of Lake Inverarity were there either for a reason that mattered to the world or for skin divers and cigarette smokers. Ones and zeros. So did the couples arrange themselves." And it goes on from there. I'm not going to read the whole thing because it's a lot, but it just that sort of duality of, everything, either all of this is something or it's nothing. It either means something or it doesn't. And I think I read that passage a couple of times before I even let myself finish the book. But just because that imagery there and the way that whole area of that book was written was just so beautiful that I just wanted to kind of keep going over and analyzing how those sentences were constructed and put together and organized.
Yeah, and even the content, not from a metaphorical perspective, but from the fact that he, between that quote and the quote where Oedipa kind of looks over San Narciso for the first time and compares it to a circuit board, like I can't think of any other author who in the mid to late 60s would have been describing things like a computer. And like with these relatively recent advances in technology, like already understanding them and being able to utilize them for descriptive prose of a place or people in a place really does speak to your point before you read the quote out, like a high intellect of somebody who's just capable to use anything around them to add it into his writing in order to really bring an effect across to the reader. Like, I really wonder how those two passages where he uses computing terminology to describe things would have landed with a reader during the 60s. Like, would they even have understood what he was talking about? Yeah.
Yeah, those two paragraphs y'all chose. I'm a little mad. Those were what I was gonna choose. But to speak to Cody, your discussion of the seeming effortlessness of his prose, the way that he just somehow he simultaneously writes utterly straightforward, casual sentences that have a real cadence and sonorousness to them. And one quote that I think he's actually kind of, he's lampshading himself to some extent, is much earlier on in the chapter, when she's chatting with Emery Bortz about the dirty pictures. This very short paragraph says, "The illustrations were woodcuts executed with that crude haste to see the finished product that marks the amateur. True pornography is given us by vastly patient professionals." That second sentence is, it is about as simply as you can phrase it, but it is also incredibly beautiful on a poetic, lyrical level. And it's also him just kind of saying, it takes me a lot of work to get something that looks this pretty.
Yeah.
And I do think, talking about the effortlessness of his prose, he does, he's not Stephen King. He takes a long time to write stuff. I think that, I'm pretty sure he was working on Mason and Dixon for probably over 20 years.
Oh, for sure.
And Against the Day could be that long or even longer. I have gone to the Cormac McCarthy archives and gone over different drafts of different books, and I do wonder how much Pynchon redrafts stuff in terms of cutting stuff, or writing a whole draft and then just starting from scratch, and there's a lot of different ways to construct a novel, especially in the time of typewriters,
and quadrille paper too, because apparently that's how he did Gravity's Rainbow.
And I do think I saw something on the subreddit that he did give his papers to, I think, a
library in California.
Yeah, library in California. I think you're right, and it would be super, super interesting to have a look at those.
I don't think it'll ever happen, but
no, it's a private.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, who wants to, in maybe 2 to 3 years, go over to the Huntington Library for a field trip?
Yeah, well, my wife is a librarian, so maybe I can use that. We can get some backdoor access or something.
Or if the podcast is big enough, just bring that up.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Name drop it.
Well, and to go back to what Luke had mentioned about the amount of time it takes him to write this stuff, if I remember correctly, in the letter he wrote where he referred to Gravity's Rainbow as a pot boiler, he also mentioned that he was writing, I think it was either 3 or 4 books concurrently. And I have to wonder if that was Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, and Against the Day, because the sheer amount of historical references and just miscellanea that went into all 3 of those books and their length, it would have to take decades to do that.
Not to mention the fact that Mason and Dixon is written in language
in a 16th century style.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
to the point where scholars have said that it is essentially a 16th century novel because of how it's written.
Yeah, and I am of the opinion that those 3 novels are definitely, Gravity's Rainbow, Mason and Dixon, and Against the Day, if only because they do stake out markings around what modernity is, right around the beginning of the Enlightenment with Mason and Dixon, right around the beginning of science with Against the Day, and then in Gravity's Rainbow, really the moment where modernism ends with World War II.
Yeah.
So to go back to the quotes, my favorite of this chapter is probably, there's a few I had written down. But I'm gonna, so either you have stumbled and then there's a little bit of text, and then maybe even onto a real alternative to the exitlessness, to the absence of surprise to life that harrows the head of everybody American and you too, sweetie. That does seem to speak to the fact that, it evokes depression to me. how boring adult life can be. And as somebody that I was raised in the suburbs, I'm currently living in a suburb. I spent a fair amount of my 20s living in a suburb of Colorado Springs, Colorado. There is a sense of kind of sameness to things, to the absence of surprise to life. I found that very evocative and a nice, like, kind of concise depiction of what modern life can be for some people.
Yeah. I could have pulled a bunch more quotes from this chapter. The problem is they're all incredibly long. It's those really prosy paragraphs that are like one or two sentences of just beautiful poetic description of things. So I would also say, to jump to the most pinch on part of the chapter, I even just say the whole chapter itself is the most pinch on part of it. Just the summation of everything that had happened up to this point, the bleakness of the ending, the ambiguity of the ending, the prose that is scattered throughout. All of it, I think, is just the most penchant part of really probably of even the book.
Yeah, the last about 8 to 10 pages in my edition are super verbose and flowery, and it can be a little bit hard to pin down what he's getting at sometimes on a word by word, phrase by phrase basis, at least for me. But the prose is pretty next level, pretty peerless there at the end.
Yeah, I would say that for me, the most pinch on part of the chapter would be just after the section with the quote that I had read out. There is a part where Oedipa considers all of the different interpretations of what may have happened. One where Pierce set this up for her, one where he didn't, one where she just happened to come in contact with these signs and symbols, and sort of going through all of those different motions, not giving any credence to any of them over a different interpretation, and then just sort of the inherent terror and paranoia that leaves Oedipa with, not only feels very Pynchon-esque in a sense of his greater canon about paranoia and about the inability to understand the truth behind certain things, and about the capital T they, but also as it relates to this specific book of inviting those multiple interpretations from the readers. And it almost kind of feels like Pynchon is putting all of these different options in there to kind of encourage the reader to say, you can agree with any one of these, you can choose any one of these, but none of them are necessarily going to be verified or be true.
Yeah, he kind of throws so much into not just this, but I would even argue pretty much all of his books, that there's just this almost like a sensory overload. There's just so much that he's throwing into here and just saying, like, all right, here's all these parts, here's all these little pieces, and they're connected, but they're not connected. So make of it what you will. And I think what it reminds me of, and I think what kind of helped me get into his work, is that's also the same explanation I used to kind of sell David Lynch to friends. Of you have this artist who's not going to make something that's linear. It's not going to be this straightforward, here's a story about a woman who goes on a journey. Here's this story, and you're going to get a lot of things that come at you from different angles, and you're going to come away with something this time, and then you're going to want to go back and re-examine it to see, was that right? And you're going to pick up more pieces along the way, and more pieces along the way the next time, and keep coming away with more information and also different interpretations of that information at the same time. So it's never a chore to reread his work, because there's always new things to kind of parse out and find in there.
Yeah, I'd agree. And in a similar metaphor, the way I think about after you've reached the point where you're more or less acquainted with the the material of the book, what you're left with from Pynchon's novels is what I always describe as if you had one of those wooden desk puzzles where you take it apart, you put it together. It's like he hands you a bag full of all the pieces, and you start to put it together every time you read it. And every time you start to almost put the last piece in, you realize that you have it all out of sorts, you have it all out of order, or in another sense, that it almost all fits together perfectly, except that everything is warped away from itself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I kind of used a similar metaphor with, again, to go back to David Lynch, was you know a lot of filmmakers, a lot of authors are going to tell you a story, and that, if it's a puzzle, so to speak, they'll put the pieces in front of you and they will put it together for you. They'll show you how all these pieces connect. But with someone like Pynchon, it's just, here's these pieces, have fun, figure it out. And however you get to the end of it is fine. But I like that, what you kind of added to that, there's always, it comes out a little warped, or something's missing, here and there.
And actually, Kate, you chose my most Pynchonian part of the chapter. Thank you again.
You got to start going first, Will.
Apologies.
Apparently, but I'll narrow it down to a specific couple of lines in that section. She's realizing that she hopes she's crazy. That night, she sat for hours, too numb even to drink, teaching herself to breathe in a vacuum, for this, oh God, was the void. There was nobody who could help her, no world. They were all on thing, mad, possible as dead.
That quote does bring up something that I think I'm going to try to explore in the general discussion. And it goes back to the tower in the first chapter for me. But it does, this whole book, and Oedipa, it seems to be like one of Oedipa's problems is that, she seems to expect things to change for her, or for her to find some like magic key to explain everything that's going on and what she's been going through. And it's hard for me to put this into words, but it does seem to be like there is this sense that like Oedipa struggles with the fact that wherever she goes, whoever she's around, she's still herself. She still has like, just because you go on vacation doesn't mean that your problems go away, I guess, is maybe a kind of simple way to put it. It seems to be like, she spends this entire book searching for something to fill that void, and that void is something that just can't be filled, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I like that. And that actually kind of immediately made me think of, there's a Neil Young song called On the Beach, and there's a line in that song that's, though my problems are meaningless, that don't make them go away. And
yeah, that's a beautiful song.
Yeah, that just immediately came to my mind when you mentioned that. So I'm gonna have to go and listen to that now.
Great album.
It's my favorite Neil Young album. Like, it's probably my favorite album.
The history of the composition of that album is wild if you've never looked into it.
Oh yeah, the honey sliders and all that kind of It's so like I'm a huge Neil Young fan, so yeah, I don't want to go off and start a Neil Young podcast just yet, but maybe down the road. So that's unless anybody has anything else, that's chapter 6. We have finished the book, and
Woohoo!
Yeah. I don't want to mention what our next book is going to be just yet. We are going to come back and do a sort of wrap-up episode on Lot 49 and just kind of discuss the book in total. Not a full-length episode. I think it'll probably just be a shorter, kind of like our shorter episode on the Courier's Revenge. And at that point, we'll talk about what our next book is. But yeah, this has been quite the journey. As I mentioned, I've read this a couple of times in the past, and I think doing this with you all really has given me a lot more insight into the book and helped me kind of recontextualize it and reanalyze it, which obviously is the point of doing this in the first place. So, yeah, we'll come back a week from now and do a wrap up on Lot 49. and kind of discuss the future from there. So, want to thank everyone again for listening and for sticking with us through this book. It's been a lot of fun. I want to thank Connor, who has edited the last few episodes for us and has done that on his own free time. So big thanks to him. If you have questions, comments, anything, please email us at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com, or you can throw something up on Reddit and one of us will catch it and hopefully be able to discuss it. And until next week, we'll see you all then.
See y'all.